Well, Laura, thank you, and to Sagia, thank you for organizing this and having me back. It is great to be here. Going last, I'm struck by the fact that I run the risk of repeating what's been said, but I'll try not to do that. I may echo a couple points, but I think I want to take it into a slightly different direction as well. You know, as the minister said when we started, we are seeing recovery around the world. He said it's happening at different speeds in different parts of the world. It's undoubtedly true. An economist I was talking to once referred to this as the love recovery, not L-O-V-E, but L-U-V. It's L-shaped primarily in most of Western Europe, U-shaped in North America, and V-shaped in almost the rest of the world. We're seeing that very, very clearly. I think I saw some data that said that the expected 2011 growth rates in the OECD countries are something like 1.5 points. And the non-OECD countries' expected 2011 growth is substantially over 6%. And so there are clearly different speeds, but it is wonderful to be talking about growth again as opposed to the reverse. Having said that, I do think there are some risks to this recovery. And some have been commented on before. I think one of the real risks is a very natural tendency among countries or regions to go it alone. During the depths of the crisis, what was really wonderful was how connected the world became. The G20 discussed almost everything, whether it was how to deal with toxic assets, whether it was capital, liquidity, you name it. The policies weren't always the same, but there was a whole lot of cooperation and coordination. And one of the risks I see is when you get into recovery is there's a human tendency to say, you know what? I'm going to take care of my own. Nothing will squeeze out this recovery faster than that activity. It will raise trade barriers, it will raise protectionism, it will raise regulatory arbitrage opportunities, it will break the trust, Laura, that you talked about, and so I really think we've got to watch that. A second risk, and Prime Minister Blair talked about this as well, is the sovereign debt issues. They're not just across Europe, perhaps that's what's getting a lot of press. I carry a US passport. I'm worried about some of the sovereign-oriented issues in the United States as well. I think that's a second big risk. The risk I want to say a few words about, though, is I think a more fundamental one. And that is a risk that entrepreneurs stay on the sideline during this recovery and don't really get back into the game. This is so important because the entrepreneurs, not just here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but everywhere in the world, have a bigger impact, in my judgment, on job growth, on creating ideas, on creating economic activity, on lifting lives than anything else. And if they are not empowered, if they are not engaged, I think we stand a real challenge. I think there are things that both governments can do to encourage entrepreneurs and companies can do, and let me just say a few words about that. At a government level, I think the first thing is to make sure the economy is open, to avoid any protectionism. It goes back to the first risk I talked about. Fundamental, though, is the government also has to make sure that they don't have a culture that over-penalizes failure. One thing that characterizes entrepreneurial activity everywhere in the world is it doesn't work all the time the first time out. Some of the best entrepreneurs in the world have fallen down, had to pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and go at it again. If either tax systems or legal systems or a culture discourages failure too heavily, you're not going to see entrepreneurial success. Third thing is having a tax system that does encourage risk-taking, that encourages capital formation, that encourages research and development. A country can also make sure they've got finance systems at all stage of development. You've got to have venture capital at the early stage. You've got to have bank financing in the middle. You've got to have robust capital markets to encourage capital formation. All of those things are important. A final thing that I think governments can really focus on is making sure that they streamline regulations in their own country. Nothing will discourage the entrepreneur from taking risks more than a very complex, myriad path they have to go through to get anything done. If an entrepreneur has to get 500, 1,000 permits to build a plant, guess what? They're just not going to do it. Big companies can deal with it. Entrepreneurs themselves cannot. And so making sure that regulation is streamlined is critical to entrepreneurship. One other thing, that if there are too many regulations and too many permits needed in many places around the world, it increases the likelihood of corruption. And nothing, again, discourages the entrepreneur more than corruption. So if that's what governments can focus on, there's a whole separate issue that companies can focus on if they do this right. It's not just small ones. Big companies around the world have to make sure that they are as entrepreneurial as anybody else. We call that intrapreneurship. And a company's got to have formal processes to make sure there are career paths for their real innovators. They've got to make sure within their organization that they don't do too much damage and penalize failure, because just like at a government level, a company level could do the same thing. I think they've got to make sure they reach out to governments for incentives. Companies have to make sure they engage their entire workforce. One of the real brainstorms and ways to get entrepreneurship is bringing diverse talent together and making sure, both at a country level and a company level, that there's a diversity of talent across gender, across ethnicity, across race, across all differences, is incredibly important. One of the things that we see in companies around the globe is the best ideas come from diverse teams. No doubt every one of us, the teams we're going to be on in the future will be more diverse than the teams we've been on in the past. One piece of research I've seen, and we've experienced this internally at Ernst & Young as well, is really diverse teams are rarely middle of the road in performance. They are either off the charts great or they are horrible. It all comes down to the culture that is built within the team, the culture that's built within the country, and that's the last piece of advice that we really need to make sure it takes place, not just in companies around the world, but in governments as well. With that, we deal with these risks, we're going to have great recovery. Laura, back to you.